Birds stopped singing and the forest stilled as though holding its breath. Then came the thudding sound, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. With every step, the ground seemed to quake, and you realized you had nowhere to run. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the story, I would like to ask for your support. Please subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to me and helps me a lot. I notice that many people watch the videos without subscribing, so please support me by subscribing. It means a lot to me and will help me greatly. I count on your support. Write in the comments which city you're watching from. We'll bring stories from near you. Click the like button and let's get to the case. Emily Carter stepped out onto the porch of her secluded cabin, inhaling deeply as the crisp mountain air filled her lungs. The sun was just beginning to peek over the jagged peaks of the Grand Tetons, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her body, savoring the early morning chill that promised to give way to a beautiful summer day. This is exactly what I needed, Emily murmured to herself, closing her eyes and listening to the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. After months of writer's block in her cramped Jackson apartment, she had decided to rent this remote cabin for a week, hoping the change of scenery would spark her creativity. She opened her eyes and surveyed the breathtaking landscape before her. The cabin sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense pine forest. In the distance, the majestic peaks of Grand Teton National Park stretched towards the sky, their snow-capped summits glowing in the early morning light. Emily pulled out her phone and snapped a quick picture, though she knew it couldn't possibly capture the raw beauty of the scene. She posted it to her social media with the caption, "Day 1 in Paradise. Let's see if these mountains can cure writer's block. Am writing Grand Tetons." As she lowered her phone, a movement in the nearby bushes caught her eye. Emily froze, her heart suddenly racing. She scanned the tree line but saw nothing out of the ordinary. After a moment, a small chipmunk darted out from under a bush and scampered across the clearing. Emily let out a nervous laugh. "Get it together, Carter," she chided herself. "You're a city girl, but you're not that much of a city girl." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Emily shook her head, trying to dispel the notion. She was here to write, not to let her imagination run wild with paranoid fantasies. Stepping back inside the cabin, Emily made her way to the small kitchenette. She pulled out a cast-iron skillet and a package of thick-cut bacon from the fridge. "Nothing like a hearty breakfast to start the day," she said aloud, her voice sounding oddly loud in the quiet cabin. As the bacon began to sizzle in the pan, its rich aroma filled the small space. Emily hummed to herself, enjoying the simple pleasure of cooking in this rustic setting. She cracked a few eggs into a bowl and began to whisk them, already planning the opening scene of her novel in her mind. The sizzling of the bacon grew louder, drowning out the subtle sounds of the forest outside. Emily was so engrossed in her thoughts and the task at hand that she failed to notice the heavy footsteps approaching the cabin. A shadow passed by the window, and for a split second, Emily convinced herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. She paused, spatula in hand, and listened intently, but all she could hear was the popping of the bacon grease and the gentle whoosh of the breeze outside. "You're letting this place get to you," Emily muttered, turning back to the stove. "Next thing you know, you'll be writing about axe murderers in the woods instead of your romance novel." She chuckled at her own joke, but the sound died in her throat as she heard a low, rumbling growl from just outside the cabin. Emily's body went rigid, her mind racing to identify the sound. It wasn't a dog. It was too deep, too primal. Before she could process what was happening, the flimsy screen door suddenly exploded inward with a deafening crash. Emily whirled around, the spatula clattering to the floor as she came face to face with her worst nightmare. A massive grizzly bear stood in the doorway, its enormous frame filling the entire entrance. Its small, dark eyes were fixed hungrily on Emily, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the cooking bacon. Emily's mind went blank with terror. She had read about bear encounters, had even joked about them with friends before coming out here. But nothing could have prepared her for the sheer, overwhelming presence of the creature before her. The bear let out another low growl, taking a step into the cabin. Emily's survival instincts finally kicked in, and she began to slowly back away, her eyes never leaving the enormous predator. "Nice bear," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Good bear. You don't want to eat me. I'm all skin and bones." Her back hit the counter, and Emily realized with growing horror that she had nowhere left to go. The bear took another step forward, its massive paws leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor. Emily's hand fumbled behind her, desperately searching for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. Her fingers closed around the handle of the still-hot cast-iron skillet. In a move born of pure desperation, Emily grabbed the skillet and held it out in front of her like a shield. "Stay back," she yelled, trying to make her voice sound as authoritative as possible. The sudden movement and loud noise seemed to startle the bear. It reared up on its hind legs, letting out a roar that shook Emily to her very core. She could smell its hot, rancid breath, could see the yellowed teeth that could easily tear her apart. Time seemed to stand still as Emily locked eyes with the enormous grizzly. In that moment, all her dreams, her ambitions, her half-finished novel, none of it mattered. She was face to face with a force of nature, a creature that cared nothing for her hopes or fears. The bear's massive paw swung towards her with frightening speed. Emily tried to dodge, but in the confined space of the small cabin kitchen, there was nowhere to go. She felt a searing pain as the bear's claws connected with her arm, tearing through flesh and muscle. Emily screamed in agony, stumbling backwards. The skillet fell from her grasp, clattering to the floor and spilling hot bacon grease everywhere. The bear, momentarily startled by the noise and the hot oil, took a step back. Clutching her injured arm, Emily scrambled towards the back door. Blood dripped from her wound, leaving a trail on the wooden floor. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, panic making her movements clumsy. "Please, please, please," she sobbed, finally managing to turn the deadbolt. She could hear the bear recovering from its surprise, its heavy breathing growing closer. With a final burst of desperate strength, Emily yanked the door open and burst out into the cool morning air. The peaceful scene that had greeted her just minutes ago now seemed like a cruel joke. The beautiful forest had revealed its deadly side, and Emily Carter was running for her life. As she sprinted towards the tree line, bare feet slipping on the dew-covered grass, Emily could hear the bear crashing through the cabin behind her. The majestic mountains that had inspired her now loomed ominously, indifferent witnesses to the primal drama unfolding in their shadow. Emily plunged into the forest, branches whipping across her face as she ran blindly, driven by pure terror. The bear's heavy footfalls echoed behind her, a grim reminder that in this untamed wilderness, she was no longer the author of her own story. She was prey. Time seemed to stand still as Emily locked eyes with the enormous grizzly, its hot, rancid breath filling the air between them. The bear's dark, beady eyes held no emotion, no mercy, just an instinctive primal hunger that sent chills down Emily's spine. "Oh God," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the thundering of her own heartbeat. She was acutely aware of every detail of the moment. The rough texture of the wooden counter pressing against her back, the warm stickiness of blood trickling down her injured arm, the overpowering scent of bacon now mixed with the musky odor of the bear. The grizzly let out a low, rumbling growl that Emily felt in her very bones. It took another lumbering step forward, its massive paw leaving a wet, muddy print on the kitchen floor. Emily's eyes darted around the small cabin, desperately searching for an escape route, but her heart sank as she realized the horrible truth. There was nowhere to run in the confined space of her small cabin kitchen. "Nice bear," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You don't want to eat me. I'm all gristle and bone. Why don't you just turn around and go back to the woods? There's plenty of berries out there. Delicious berries. Much better than stringy riders." The bear, unsurprisingly, didn't respond to her nervous rambling. Instead, it rose up on its hind legs, towering over Emily. Its size was staggering, easily 8 feet tall with paws the size of dinner plates and claws that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. Emily's mind raced, trying to remember everything she'd ever read about bear encounters. "Make yourself big," she muttered. "Make noise. Don't run." But faced with the reality of a half-ton predator in her kitchen, all that advice seemed woefully inadequate. Slowly, Emily began to edge along the counter, hoping to make her way to the back door without provoking the bear. "That's right," she said, forcing a calm she didn't feel into her voice. "You just stay there and I'll just—" Her words were cut off as the bear's massive paw swung towards her with frightening speed. Emily tried to duck, but in the cramped space there was nowhere to go. She felt a searing pain as the bear's claws connected with her arm, the force of the blow spinning her around and sending her crashing into the stove. Emily cried out in agony, clutching her injured arm. The bear's claws had torn through her flesh like it was tissue paper, leaving deep, jagged wounds. Blood flowed freely, staining her shirt and dripping onto the floor. The pain seemed to kick Emily's survival instincts into overdrive. Adrenaline surged through her body, momentarily dulling the pain in her arm. With her uninjured hand, she grabbed the first thing she could reach, a heavy cast-iron skillet still hot from cooking bacon. "Stay back!" Emily screamed, swinging the skillet wildly. The sudden movement and loud noise seemed to startle the bear, causing it to take a step back. Seizing the moment, Emily stumbled backwards, knocking over pots and pans in a desperate attempt to create a barrier between herself and the relentless predator. The cacophony of clanging metal filled the small cabin, mixing with Emily's panicked breathing and the bear's angry growls. "Help!" Emily yelled, knowing it was futile. The nearest neighbor was miles away. No one would hear her. No one would come to her rescue. She was entirely alone in this life-or-death struggle. The bear, momentarily confused by the noise and chaos, pawed at the fallen cookware. Emily used this distraction to make a dash for the back door, her bare feet slipping on the blood-slicked floor. Her fingers fumbled with the doorknob, panic making her movements clumsy. Come on," she muttered, glancing over her shoulder to see the bear recovering from its surprise. Finally, the door swung open and Emily burst out into the cool morning air. The peaceful forest that had seemed so welcoming just minutes ago now loomed ominously, full of unknown dangers. Blood dripped from her injured arm as Emily fumbled to close the door behind her, praying it would buy her a few precious seconds. She could hear the bear inside, its heavy body crashing against furniture as it made its way towards her. Emily's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. The car was parked on the other side of the cabin, but even if she could reach it, she didn't have the keys. They were still inside, along with her phone and any chance of calling for help. The trees. It was her only option. Emily sprinted towards the forest line, her bare feet slipping on the dew-covered grass. Behind her, she heard the sickening crack of wood splintering as the bear burst through the back door. "No! No! No!" Emily panted, pushing herself to run faster. She could hear the bear's heavy footfalls right behind her, each thud sending a jolt of terror through her body. As she reached the tree line, Emily risked a glance over her shoulder. The sight nearly stopped her heart. The bear was mere feet away, its powerful legs eating up the distance between them with terrifying speed. Emily plunged into the forest, branches whipping across her face as she ran blindly. She had no idea where she was going, no plan beyond the primal urge to escape. Each step was a gamble between escape and a deadly misstep. The forest floor was treacherous, covered in roots and loose rocks. Emily's bare feet were soon cut and bruised, but she hardly noticed the pain. All she could focus on was the sound of the bear crashing through the underbrush behind her. "Help!" Emily screamed again, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Somebody help me!" But her cries only seemed to spur the bear on. Emily could hear its labored breathing getting closer, and she knew that at any moment she could feel its claws tearing into her back. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster. Branches tore at her clothes and skin, leaving scratches that mingled with the blood from her arm. The woods seemed to go on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows. Just as Emily felt her strength beginning to fail, she spotted a cluster of boulders ahead. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance she had. With a final burst of speed, she raced towards the rocks. "Please," she gasped, reaching the boulders. "Please let this work." Emily wedged herself into a narrow gap between two large rocks, scraping her skin raw in the process. She made herself as small as possible, pressing her back against the cool stone and pulling her knees to her chest. The bear's massive form appeared through the trees, its black eyes scanning the area. Emily held her breath, praying that the rocks would mask her scent, that the bear would lose interest and move on. But as the grizzly's gaze locked onto her hiding spot, Emily realized with sinking dread that her ordeal was far from over. Trapped between the rocks with a determined predator blocking her only escape route, Emily Carter faced the very real possibility that she might not live to see another sunrise. The bear let out a low, menacing growl that sent shivers down Emily's spine. As it began to circle her hiding spot, searching for a way to reach its cornered prey, Emily closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. The beautiful wilderness that had drawn her here had revealed its deadly side, and now, huddled among the rocks with a grizzly bear mere feet away, Emily understood the true meaning of terror. Emily burst out of the back door, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the suffocating terror inside the cabin. Her bare feet hit the damp grass, and for a split second, she marveled at how something so ordinary could feel so alien in this moment of pure survival. "Run!" she gasped to herself, her voice barely a whisper. Just run. The peaceful forest that had seemed so inviting just hours ago now loomed before her, both a potential sanctuary and a deadly maze. Emily's mind raced, trying to remember anything useful from the hiking guides she'd skimmed before her trip. Which way was the ranger station? The main road? A thunderous crash from inside the cabin jolted her into action. The bear was coming. Emily sprinted towards the tree line, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She could hear the bear's heavy footfalls behind her, each thud sending a fresh wave of terror through her body. "Help!" she screamed as she ran, knowing it was futile. The nearest neighbor was miles away. "Somebody, please." Her bare feet slipped on the dew-covered grass, nearly sending her sprawling. Emily caught herself, the sudden movement sending a jolt of pain through her injured arm. Blood dripped from the wound, leaving a macabre trail behind her. As she reached the edge of the forest, Emily risked a glance over her shoulder. The sight nearly stopped her heart. The grizzly had burst through the back door of the cabin, wood splintering around its massive frame. Its black eyes locked onto her, and it let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. "Oh God," Emily whimpered, plunging into the forest. Branches whipped across her face as she ran blindly, each step a gamble between escape and a deadly misstep. The forest floor was treacherous, covered in roots and loose rocks that threatened to trip her with every stride. "Stay on your feet," Emily panted to herself. "Just stay on your feet." She could hear the bear crashing through the underbrush behind her, its powerful body easily pushing through obstacles that slowed her down. The sound of snapping branches and heavy breathing seemed to come from every direction, amplified by her terror. Emily's lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster. Her legs ached, muscles screaming in protest at the sudden exertion. But the fear of what would happen if she slowed down kept her moving. "Please," she gasped, not sure who or what she was pleading to. "Please, I don't want to die like this." A low-hanging branch caught her across the face, leaving a stinging cut on her cheek. Emily barely noticed, too focused on the sounds of pursuit behind her. She ducked under another branch, leaped over a fallen log, her movements fueled by pure adrenaline. The forest seemed endless, a green labyrinth with no clear path or destination. Emily had no idea which direction she was running, no plan beyond putting as much distance between herself and the bear as possible. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet changed. Instead of soft forest loam, she found herself running on loose scree. Emily's heart sank as she realized she was heading up a steep slope. No, she muttered, but there was no time to change course. She could hear the bear's labored breathing getting closer, and she knew that at any moment she could feel its claws tearing into her back. Emily scrambled up the slope, her bare feet slipping on the loose rocks. Each step sent a shower of pebbles skittering down behind her. The incline was brutal, sapping what little strength she had left. "Keep moving," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged pants. "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop." At the top of the slope, Emily paused for a split second, trying to get her bearings. The brief respite allowed her to notice the pain in her feet for the first time. They were cut and bleeding from her frantic flight through the forest. But there was no time to dwell on it. A crashing sound from below told her the bear was still in pursuit, undeterred by the difficult terrain. Emily looked around desperately, searching for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. That's when she spotted it. A cluster of large boulders a short distance away, halfway down the other side of the slope. "Please let this work," she whispered, half prayer and half desperate hope. With renewed energy born of desperation, Emily ran towards the boulders. The downward slope made her steps awkward and unsteady, but she pushed through, ignoring the protests of her battered body. As she neared the rock formation, Emily could hear the bear cresting the top of the slope behind her. Its roar echoed through the forest, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Emily reached the boulders and quickly assessed her options. There was a narrow gap between two of the largest rocks, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. Without hesitation, she wedged herself into the crevice, scraping her skin raw in the process. She pushed herself as far back as she could, making herself as small as possible. The rough stone pressed against her back, a cold, unyielding reminder of her desperate situation. Emily held her breath as the bear's massive form came into view. It paused at the top of the slope, its nostrils flaring as it scented the air. For a moment, hope flared in Emily's chest. Maybe it would lose her trail. Maybe it would give up and wander off. But then the bear's head swiveled in her direction, its small, dark eyes focusing on her hiding spot. Emily's heart sank as she realized her ordeal was far from over. The grizzly lumbered down the slope towards the boulders, its movements surprisingly graceful for such a large creature. It circled the rock formation, occasionally rising up on its hind legs to peer over the top. Emily pressed herself further back into the crevice, ignoring the sharp edges of rock digging into her skin. She grabbed a nearby branch, knowing it was a pitiful weapon against such a powerful creature, but desperate for any means of defense. Time stretched endlessly as the bear circled her hiding spot. Occasionally, it would let out a low, menacing growl that sent shivers down Emily's spine. She could smell its musky odor, could almost feel the heat radiating from its massive body. "Go away," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, just go away." But the bear showed no signs of leaving. It seemed determined to wait her out, confident in its superior strength and endurance. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, Emily wondered if she'd live to see another dawn. She thought of her unfinished novel, of the family and friends she might never see again. Tears welled up in her eyes, a mix of fear, pain, and desperate hopelessness. "I don't want to die here," she murmured, tightening her grip on the branch. "Not like this. Not alone." The bear let out another growl, closer this time. Emily could see its shadow looming over her, blocking out what little light reached her hiding spot. She raised the branch, ready to fight with everything she had left. But just as she thought the end had come, a new sound cut through the tense silence. A distant shout, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Emily's eyes widened. Could it be? Was someone actually out here? "Help!" she screamed, her voice hoarse from fear and exertion. "I'm over here. Help me." The bear's attention shifted toward the sound, its ears perking up. For a moment it seemed torn between its cornered prey and this new potential threat. Emily held her breath, hope and terror warring in her chest. She didn't know if this new development would be her salvation or just add another victim to the bear's rampage. As the shout came again, closer this time, Emily realized that her desperate escape had led to a new, uncertain chapter in her fight for survival. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. This was a story she'd never forget, if she lived to tell it. Emily wedged herself deeper between the two large rocks, her injured arm throbbing as she tried to make herself as small as possible. The rough surface of the stone pressed against her back, cold and unyielding. She could feel every scrape and bruise on her body, the pain a constant reminder of her desperate flight through the forest. The bear's massive form loomed over her, its black eyes searching for a way to reach its cornered prey. Emily's heart raced, each beat thundering in her ears. She gripped the branch tighter, knowing it was a pitiful weapon against such a powerful creature, but desperate for any means of defense. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, just stay back." The bear let out a low, menacing growl that sent shivers down Emily's spine. It paced back and forth in front of her hiding spot, occasionally rising up on its hind legs to peer over the top of the boulders. Its powerful claws left deep gouges in the earth, a chilling demonstration of what they could do to human flesh. Emily's mind raced, trying to remember everything she'd ever read about bear encounters. Make yourself big, make noise, fight back if it attacks. But trapped in this narrow crevice, None of that advice seemed applicable. She was completely at the mercy of the grizzly's whims. Time stretched endlessly as the bear circled her hiding spot. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual morning chorus of birds and insects silenced by the presence of the apex predator. Emily could hear nothing but her own ragged breathing and the occasional snuffle from the bear as it tried to catch her scent. "Someone has to come," Emily murmured to herself, trying to hold on to hope. "The ranger, someone must have heard me scream." But as the minutes ticked by with no sign of rescue, that hope began to fade. The reality of her situation sank in. She was miles from any help, trapped by a creature that could tear her apart with ease. Tears welled up in her eyes, a mix of fear and hopeless frustration. The bear suddenly let out another growl, this one deeper and more threatening than before. It had lowered its head, staring directly at Emily through the gap in the rocks. She could see the intelligence in its eyes, the calculation as it tried to figure out how to reach her. "No," Emily gasped, pressing herself even further back. "No, no, no." The grizzly began to paw at the rocks, its massive strength evident as it easily shifted smaller boulders out of its way. Emily realized with growing horror that it was only a matter of time before it found a way to reach her. In a desperate bid to scare it off, Emily began to shout and wave her branch. "Get out of here," she yelled, her voice cracking with fear. "Go on, get." The sudden noise seemed to startle the bear, causing it to take a step back. Encouraged, Emily continued, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. "I said get out of here, you overgrown furball. Go find some berries or something." For a moment it seemed to work. The bear paused in its efforts to reach her, appearing almost confused by this sudden show of defiance from its prey. But then its eyes narrowed, and it let out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Emily's brief surge of bravery evaporated in an instant. She shrank back, the branch falling from her trembling hands. "I'm sorry," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. Please don't hurt me." The bear resumed its efforts to reach her, its powerful claws scraping against the rock. Emily could hear the stone grinding, small pieces breaking off under the relentless assault. It was only a matter of time before the grizzly broke through. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, Emily wondered if she'd live to see another dawn. She thought of her family, her friends, her unfinished novel, all the things she'd left unsaid, the experiences she'd never have. A wave of regret washed over her, nearly as overwhelming as her fear. "I don't want to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not like this. Not here." The bear suddenly paused in its attack on the rocks, its head swiveling to look back into the forest. Its ears perked up and it let out a low, rumbling growl. Emily held her breath, straining to hear what had caught the grizzly's attention. Then she heard it, a distant shout, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Hope surged through her, giving her a second wind. "Help!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "I'm over here, help me!" The bear's attention was now fully on the source of the new sound. It rose up on its hind legs, towering over the boulders as it tried to locate the potential threat. Emily could see the tension in its massive body, ready to charge at a moment's notice. Another shout rang out, closer this time. Emily could make out words now. "Hello? Is someone there?" "Here!" Emily yelled back, her voice cracking. "I'm here! There's a bear!" The sound of running footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the crack of breaking branches. Emily's heart raced, torn between hope for rescue and fear for whoever was approaching. She knew all too well how dangerous the bear could be. Suddenly, a figure burst through the trees into the small clearing by the boulders. It was a man in a ranger uniform, his face flushed from exertion. He skidded to a stop as he took in the scene before him, the massive grizzly, still up on its hind legs and Emily trapped between the rocks. "Oh my God," the ranger breathed, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his back. The bear dropped back to all fours, letting out a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Emily watched in horror as it turned its attention fully to the newcomer, its powerful muscles bunching as it prepared to charge. "Look out!" Emily screamed, but her warning was unnecessary. The ranger had already unslung his rifle, bringing it up smoothly to his shoulder. "Hey!" he shouted at the bear, his voice firm and authoritative. "Back off." For a moment, everything seemed frozen in a tableau of tension. The bear poised to attack, the ranger with his rifle trained on the massive predator, and Emily watching helplessly from her rocky prison. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, in a blur of motion, the standoff exploded into chaos. The bear charged towards the ranger with shocking speed for such a large animal. Emily heard the crack of a warning shot, saw the dirt kick up just in front of the charging grizzly. "No!" Emily cried out, certain she was about to witness the ranger being torn apart. But the warning shot had done its job. The bear skidded to a halt, clearly startled by the loud noise and impact so close to it. It rose up on its hind legs again, roaring its defiance, but seemed unwilling to come any closer to the source of the frightening sound. The ranger stood his ground, his rifle never wavering from its aim at the bear's center mass. "That's right," he called out, his voice steady despite the danger. "You don't want any part of this. Go on, get out of here." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the bear remained where it was, swaying slightly as it considered its options. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Then, with a final growl that rumbled through the clearing, the grizzly dropped back to all fours. It gave one last look at Emily in her hiding spot, then turned and lumbered off into the forest. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves marked its retreat until finally, silence fell over the clearing. Emily sagged against the rocks, the adrenaline that had been keeping her going suddenly draining away. She felt lightheaded, the events of the past hours catching up with her all at once. The ranger approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of the bear's return. "Ma'am?" he called out softly. "Are you hurt? Can you come out of there?" Emily tried to respond but found she couldn't form words. A sob escaped her throat instead, the fear and relief overwhelming her. She began to cry in earnest, her whole body shaking with the release of tension. "It's okay," the ranger said, his voice gentle now. "You're safe. Let's get you out of there and back to the station. Everything's going to be all right now." As the ranger helped her out from between the rocks, Emily knew that while the immediate danger had passed, the memory of this terrifying encounter would stay with her forever. The peaceful forest she had come to for inspiration had shown its deadly side, and Emily Carter would never look at the wilderness the same way again. A distant shout broke the tense silence, and Emily realized with a mix of relief and terror that someone else had entered this deadly game. Her heart, already racing from fear, seemed to skip a beat at the sound of a human voice. "Hello?" the voice called out, echoing through the trees. "Is anyone out there?" Emily's first instinct was to cry out for help, but she hesitated, her eyes darting to the massive grizzly that still loomed over her hiding spot. The bear's attention had shifted towards the sound, its ears perking up and nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of a new potential threat. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please find me, but be careful." The bear's attention was now divided, its massive head swiveling between Emily's hiding spot and the direction of the shout. Emily could see the calculation in its eyes, the predator weighing its options. Another shout rang out, closer this time. "This is Ranger Mike Thompson. If anyone can hear me, call out." Emily's heart leapt at the word ranger. Help had arrived, but she knew the danger was far from over. The bear let out a low, rumbling growl, clearly agitated by the intrusion. Taking a deep breath, Emily gathered her courage and called out, "Here! I'm over here! There's a bear!" Her voice, hoarse from screaming and choked with fear, barely carried. But it was enough. She heard the sound of quickened footsteps, branches snapping underfoot as the ranger made his way towards her. The bear's reaction was immediate and terrifying. It rose up on its hind legs, towering over the boulders, and let out a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground. Emily pressed herself further back into the crevice, her injured arm throbbing with renewed pain. "Oh God," she whimpered, realizing she might have just sentenced the ranger to a gruesome fate. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The sound of running feet grew closer, and suddenly Ranger Thompson burst into view. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his face flushed from exertion and lined with concern. As he took in the scene, Emily trapped between the rocks, the massive grizzly poised to attack. His hand moved swiftly to the rifle slung across his back. "Ma'am, stay where you are," he called out, his voice steady despite the danger. "I'm going to get you out of there." The bear, momentarily startled by the ranger's sudden appearance, dropped back to all fours. It let out another growl, this one deeper and more threatening than before. Emily could see the muscles rippling under its thick fur as it prepared to charge. "Ranger, look out!" Emily screamed, but her warning was unnecessary. In one smooth motion, Ranger Thompson unslung his rifle and brought it to his shoulder. "Hey!" he shouted at the bear, his voice firm and authoritative. "Back off!" For a moment, everything seemed frozen in a tableau of tension. The bear poised to attack, the ranger with his rifle trained on the massive predator, and Emily watching helplessly from her rocky prison. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, in a blur of motion, the standoff exploded into chaos. The bear charged towards the ranger with shocking speed for such a large animal. Emily heard the crack of a warning shot, and she closed her eyes, unable to watch what she was certain would be another brutal attack. The gunshot echoed through the forest, startlingly loud in the tense silence that had preceded it. Emily's eyes snapped open at the sound, expecting to see a grisly scene. Instead, she saw the bear skidding to a halt, clearly startled by the loud noise and the impact of the bullet hitting the ground just in front of it. Ranger Thompson stood his ground, his rifle never wavering from its aim at the bear's center mass. "That's right," he called out, his voice steady despite the danger. "You don't want any part of this. Go on, get out of here." The bear rose up on its hind legs again, roaring its defiance. But Emily could see uncertainty in its posture now. The warning shot had changed the equation, introducing an element of danger that the bear hadn't anticipated. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the grizzly remained where it was, swaying slightly as it considered its options. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Then, with a final growl that rumbled through the clearing, the bear dropped back to all fours. It gave one last look at Emily in her hiding spot, then turned and lumbered off into the forest. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves marked its retreat, until finally, silence fell over the clearing. Emily sagged against the rocks, the adrenaline that had been keeping her going suddenly draining away. She felt lightheaded, the events of the past hours catching up with her all at once. Ranger Thompson approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of the bear's return. "Ma'am?" he called out softly. "Are you hurt? Can you come out of there?" Emily tried to respond, but found she couldn't form words. A sob escaped her throat instead, the fear and relief overwhelming her. She began to cry in earnest, her whole body shaking with the release of tension. "It's okay," the ranger said, his voice gentle now. "You're safe. Let's get you out of there and back to the station. Everything's going to be all right now." With careful movements, Ranger Thompson helped Emily out from between the rocks. As she emerged into the open, the full extent of her ordeal became apparent. Her clothes were torn and bloodied, her bare feet cut and bruised from her frantic flight through the forest. The gash on her arm from the bear's initial attack was still oozing blood. "Jesus," the ranger muttered, taking in her condition. "You've been through hell, haven't you? Let's get you patched up." He helped Emily to a fallen log where she could sit, then pulled a first aid kit from his pack. As he began to clean and bandage her wounds, Emily found her voice again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I thought I was going to die out here." Ranger Thompson gave her a reassuring smile as he worked. "You're tougher than you look, ma'am. Not many people could have survived what you just went through." As the immediate danger passed and the reality of her rescue sank in, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, leaving her feeling drained and shaky. "I'm Emily," she said, realizing she hadn't even introduced herself. "Emily Carter. I was staying at a cabin, writing. The bear just came out of nowhere." "Easy now, Emily," the ranger soothed, finishing up with her bandages. "You're safe now. We'll get you back to the station and call for medical assistance. Then you can tell us everything that happened." As Ranger Thompson helped her to her feet, Emily took one last look at the forest around them. The peaceful wilderness that had drawn her here for inspiration now seemed alien and threatening. She knew that while she had survived this ordeal, the memory of it would stay with her forever. "Come on," the ranger said gently, supporting her as they began the trek back to civilization. "Let's get you home." As they made their way through the forest, Emily leaned heavily on Ranger Thompson, grateful for his steady presence. The sounds of the wilderness that had once seemed so soothing now set her nerves on edge, every rustle in the underbrush making her flinch. But with each step away from the scene of her terrifying encounter, Emily felt a little stronger. She had faced nature at its most primal and survived. Whatever came next, she knew she could handle it. The sun was climbing higher in the sky as they emerged from the tree line, the ranger station visible in the distance. Emily squinted in the bright light, the ordinary sight of buildings and vehicles suddenly seeming extraordinary after her night of terror. As they approached the station, Emily saw other rangers running out to meet them, their faces etched with concern. She knew she had a long road ahead, medical treatment, police reports, probably therapy to deal with the trauma. But in that moment, safe and surrounded by people eager to help, Emily Carter allowed herself to believe that everything really would be all right. Emily opened her eyes to see the bear lumbering away into the forest, its massive form disappearing between the trees. The sudden absence of the immediate threat left her feeling oddly hollow, as if the fear that had been driving her had been the only thing keeping her upright. Ranger Thompson stood nearby, his rifle still at the ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of the bear's return. The forest around them seemed to exhale, the tension of the standoff slowly dissipating as birds tentatively resumed their morning songs. Is it really gone?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The ranger nodded, his eyes still alert. "Looks like it, but we should move quickly. Bears can be unpredictable and we don't want to risk it coming back." He turned to Emily, his face softening as he took in her battered state. "Can you walk? We need to get you to the station and call for medical assistance." Emily tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her, the adrenaline that had kept her going suddenly evaporating. The ranger quickly moved to support her, his strong arm wrapping around her waist. "Easy there," he said gently. "Let's take it slow. I'm Mike, by the way. Mike Thompson." "Emily," she managed to reply. "Emily Carter, I was just trying to write." As they began to make their way through the forest, Emily nearly collapsed as the full extent of her injuries became apparent. Every step sent shockwaves of pain through her body. Her bare feet, cut and bruised from her frantic flight, left small bloodstains on the forest floor. "You're doing great, Emily," Ranger Thompson encouraged her. "The station's not far. Just a little further." Emily nodded weakly, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. As they walked, the events of the past hours began to replay in her mind. The bear crashing through her cabin door, the terrifying chase through the forest, the long hours trapped between the rocks. She shuddered, fresh tears springing to her eyes. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. "I really thought that was it." The ranger gave her a reassuring squeeze. "But you didn't. You survived. That's something to be proud of, Emily. Not many people could have made it through what you just did." As they emerged from the tree line, the ranger station came into view. It was a modest building, but to Emily it looked like a fortress of safety. She could see other rangers running towards them, their faces etched with concern. "Mike, what happened?" one of them called out. "Bear attack," Ranger Thompson replied grimly. "Call for an ambulance. We need to get her to a hospital." The next few minutes passed in a blur for Emily. She was gently lowered onto a bench outside the station. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders, and a bottle of water was pressed into her hands. Voices swirled around her, but she couldn't focus on any of them. A female ranger knelt in front of her, her kind eyes filled with concern. "Emily, can you hear me? We've called for an ambulance. They'll be here soon. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" Emily blinked, trying to gather her thoughts. My arm," she said, looking down at the makeshift bandage Ranger Thompson had applied. "The bear, it got my arm. And my feet. I ran so far." The ranger nodded, carefully examining Emily's injuries. "You've been through a lot, but you're safe now. We're going to take good care of you." As the adrenaline continued to wear off, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Emily started to shake uncontrollably, her breath coming in short gasps. I can't breathe," she gasped, panic rising in her chest. "It's okay, Emily," the female ranger soothed, taking Emily's hands in hers. "You're having a panic attack. It's completely normal after what you've been through. Try to focus on my voice. Breathe with me, okay? In and out, in and out." Emily struggled to follow the ranger's instructions, gradually feeling her breathing slow. As she calmed, she became aware of the activity around her. Rangers were on radios, coordinating with emergency services and organizing search parties to ensure the bear had truly left the area. Ranger Thompson approached, a steaming mug in his hand. "Here," he said, offering it to Emily. "It's just tea, but it might help." Emily took the mug gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. As she sipped the tea, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a nearby window. She barely recognized the wild-eyed, blood-streaked face staring back at her. "Oh God," she whispered, the full impact of her ordeal hitting her anew. "Emily," Ranger Thompson said gently, crouching down beside her. "I know this is hard, but I need to ask you a few questions about what happened. It'll help us file the report and make sure we're doing everything we can to keep people safe. Are you up for that?" Emily nodded weakly. "I'll try." Over the next few minutes, she recounted her terrifying experience. The bear breaking into her cabin, her desperate flight through the forest, the long hours trapped between the rocks. Ranger Thompson listened attentively, his face grim as he took notes. "You did everything right, Emily," he said when she finished. "You survived. That's what matters." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air, and Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Help was here. As the paramedics arrived and began to assess her injuries, Emily found herself looking back towards the forest. The peaceful woods that had drawn her here now seemed alien and threatening. She knew that while she had survived this ordeal, the memory of it would stay with her forever. One of the paramedics gently touched her shoulder. "Ma'am, we're going to take you to the hospital now. You've got some nasty injuries that need tending to." As they helped her onto the stretcher, Emily caught Ranger Thompson's eye. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding me, for saving me." He nodded, a small smile on his face. "You're welcome, Emily. Take care of yourself. And remember, you're stronger than you know." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began to move, Emily leaned back, exhaustion overtaking her. The reality of what she'd just survived began to sink in as the ambulance wound its way down the mountain roads, taking her back to civilization and safety. She closed her eyes, the gentle rocking of the ambulance lulling her into a state between wakefulness and sleep. In her mind, she could still see the bear, could still feel the terror of those long hours in the forest. But mixed with those images was the memory of her own survival, her own strength. As the ambulance sped towards the hospital, Emily Carter knew that while the immediate danger had passed, her journey was far from over. The bear attack had changed her, marked her in ways both visible and invisible. How she would deal with those changes, how she would move forward from this point, was a story yet to be written. Emily woke up in a hospital bed, disoriented and groggy. The sterile white walls were a jarring contrast to the vivid green of the forest that still haunted her dreams. For a moment, panic seized her as she struggled to remember where she was and how she had gotten there. "Easy there," a gentle voice said. Emily turned to see a nurse adjusting her IV drip. "You're safe. You're in Jackson Hospital." The events of the past day came rushing back. The bear, the chase, the long hours trapped between the rocks. Emily's breath quickened and the heart rate monitor beside her bed began to beat more rapidly. "Deep breaths," the nurse soothed, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "You're okay now. No bears here, I promise." Emily nodded, forcing herself to take slow, deliberate breaths. As her heart rate steadied, she became aware of the dull ache in her arm and the throbbing pain in her feet. How long have I been here?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "About 18 hours, the nurse replied. "You were pretty out of it when they brought you in. The doctor will be by soon to talk to you about your injuries." As if on cue, a tall woman in a white coat entered the room, a clipboard in hand. "Ms. Carter, I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling?" Emily tried to sit up, wincing at the movement. "Like I got hit by a truck, or mauled by a bear," Dr. Ramirez gave a sympathetic smile. Well, the latter isn't far from the truth. Let me explain the extent of your injuries. Over the next few minutes, the doctor detailed Emily's condition. The bear's claws had left deep lacerations on her arm, requiring numerous stitches. Her wrist was fractured, likely from when she fell during her escape. Her feet were cut and bruised from running barefoot through the forest, and she had various other scrapes and bruises all over her body. You're very lucky, Dr. Ramirez concluded. These injuries will heal. Many people don't survive encounters like this. Emily nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude for her survival and lingering fear from the ordeal. When can I go home? We'd like to keep you for another day or two for observation, the doctor replied. We need to make sure there's no infection setting in. After that, you'll need to take it easy for a few weeks while you heal. As Dr. Ramirez left, Emily sank back into her pillows, overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. The peaceful writing retreat she had planned had turned into a nightmare, and now she faced weeks of recovery. A knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. A police officer entered, notepad in hand. Ms. Carter, I'm Officer Dawson. If you're feeling up to it, I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened. Emily nodded, steeling herself to recount the terrifying experience once again. As she spoke, describing the bear breaking into her cabin and the frantic chase through the woods, she found the words coming easier than before. It was as if talking about it was helping to make it feel more real, less like a horrific dream. Officer Dawson listened attentively, jotting down notes. When Emily finished, he asked a few clarifying questions before closing his notepad. Thank you, Ms. Carter. Your account will help us with our report. We've already sent teams to secure the area and warn other campers and hikers. Your experience could help prevent similar incidents in the future. As the officer left, Emily felt a strange mix of emotions. While she was glad her ordeal might help others, she couldn't shake the feeling that the full impact of what she'd been through hadn't hit her yet. Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock. This time, it was a young woman with a press badge. Ms. Carter, I'm Sarah from the Jackson Hole News and Guide. We heard about your encounter with the grizzly. Would you be willing to share your story? Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to keep her experience private. But another part recognized the importance of raising awareness about the dangers in the wilderness. All right, she said finally, but just a short interview. As Emily recounted her story once again, she found herself focusing on the importance of being prepared in bear country. She talked about the need for bear spray, proper food storage, and making noise while hiking. I never thought it would happen to me, she told the reporter. I was just there to write, you know? But nature doesn't care about our plans. We have to respect it, be prepared for it. After the interview, Emily was left alone with her thoughts. She gazed out the window at the distant mountains, their beauty now tinged with a sense of danger she'd never felt before. A nurse entered, carrying a tray of food. Dinner time, she announced cheerfully. And you have some visitors if you're feeling up to it. Emily nodded, realizing she was actually hungry for the first time since the attack. As she picked at her hospital meal, there was another knock at the door. To her surprise, Ranger Thompson entered, followed by the female ranger who had helped her at the station. Emily, Ranger Thompson greeted her with a warm smile. How are you holding up? I'm surviving, Emily replied, managing a small smile of her own. Thank you again for everything. The rangers stayed for a while, checking on her condition and providing updates on the bear situation. They had tracked the grizzly's movements and were taking steps to prevent future encounters in the area. As they were leaving, Ranger Thompson paused at the door. You know, Emily, what you went through, it's the kind of thing that changes a person. It's okay if you're not okay for a while, but remember, you survived. You're stronger than you know. After they left, Emily picked up her phone, scrolling through the numerous messages of concern from friends and family. She posted a brief update on social media, assuring everyone she was recovering. As night fell, Emily found herself unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear, felt the terror of those long hours in the forest. The sterile hospital room felt confining, almost suffocating. She got up, wincing at the pain in her feet, and made her way to the window. The lights of Jackson twinkled below, the mountains a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. It was beautiful, but Emily knew she'd never see it the same way again. As she stood there, gazing out at the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life, Emily realized that her recovery would involve more than just physical healing. The bear attack had changed her, marked her in ways both visible and invisible. How she would deal with those changes, how she would move forward from this point, was a story yet to be written. But as she watched the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains, Emily felt a glimmer of determination. She had survived, and somehow, she would find a way to turn this experience into something meaningful. Perhaps, she thought, this was the story she had come here to write all along. Weeks had passed since Emily Carter's harrowing encounter with the grizzly bear, but the memory remained as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. She sat at her desk in her Jackson apartment, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. The novel she had set out to write during her ill-fated cabin retreat was still unfinished, but a new story had taken shape, one born from her terrifying experience. Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. She took a deep breath and began to type. The forest holds secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. I went seeking inspiration and found instead a primal truth about survival and the thin line between life and death. As she wrote, Emily found herself transported back to that fateful morning. She could almost smell the pine needles, feel the rough bark against her skin as she ran for her life. Her heart began to race and she forced herself to stop, closing her eyes and taking deep breaths to calm herself. A sudden noise from outside made her jump. Emily rushed to the window, her eyes scanning the street below. It was just a garbage truck, making its early morning rounds. She let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through her hair. "Get it together, Carter," she muttered to herself. "You're in the middle of the city. No bears here." But even as she said it, Emily knew that the fear had taken root deep within her. She traced the scars on her arm, the only physical evidence of her ordeal. They had healed well, pink lines that were already beginning to fade. But the mental scars, those were proving much more stubborn. Emily's phone buzzed, startling her again. It was a text from her friend, Lisa. "Hey Em, want to grab coffee? There's a new place that opened up near the park." Emily hesitated. She had been avoiding going out much since returning from the hospital, finding comfort in the safety of her apartment. But she knew she couldn't hide forever. "Sure," she typed back. "Meet you there in 30? As Emily got ready to leave, she found herself obsessively checking and rechecking the locks on her doors and windows. She knew logically that they would be no match for a determined grizzly, but the ritual gave her a sense of control. Outside, the summer sun was bright and warm. Emily walked briskly, her eyes darting around, always alert for potential dangers. When she reached the coffee shop, Lisa was already there, waving from a table on the patio. "Emily," Lisa exclaimed, standing to hug her friend. "It's so good to see you out and about. How are you feeling?" Emily managed a smile as she sat down. "I'm managing," she replied honestly. "Some days are better than others." As they chatted over their coffees, Emily found herself relaxing slightly. It felt good to engage in normal conversation, to pretend for a moment that her life hadn't been irrevocably changed. "So," Lisa said, leaning in conspiratorially, "have you heard? They caught the bear." Emily felt her heart skip a beat. "What? When?" "Just yesterday," Lisa continued, oblivious to Emily's sudden tension. "It was on the local news. They tracked it to a remote area and tranquilized it. They're relocating it far from any hiking trails or campsites." Emily nodded, unsure how to feel. Part of her was relieved that the bear wouldn't be a danger to anyone else. But another part, did they say if it was definitely the same bear? She asked. Lisa shrugged. "They think so. It matched the description and was in the same general area." "Why?" Emily shook her head. "No reason. I guess I needed to know for sure." As they finished their coffee, Emily's phone rang. It was Ranger Thompson. "Emily, it's Mike Thompson. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, not at all," Emily replied, stepping away from the table. "What's up?" "I wanted to let you know personally," the ranger said, his voice gentle. We've captured a bear that we believe was the one that attacked you. It's being relocated as we speak." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. "Are you sure it's the same one?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We're as sure as we can be," Ranger Thompson replied. "But I know that might not bring you much comfort. How are you holding up?" Emily sighed. "Emily, I'm coping. It's hard, you know. I keep expecting to see it around every corner. That's normal," the ranger assured her. "What you went through, it's not something you just get over. Have you considered talking to someone? There are support groups for survivors of animal attacks." Emily hadn't considered it, but she found herself nodding. Maybe that would help. "Thanks, Mike, for everything." After hanging up, Emily rejoined Lisa at the table. Her friend looked at her with concern. "Everything okay?" Emily nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just bear stuff. Listen, I think I'm going to head home. Thanks for the coffee." As Emily walked back to her apartment, she found her mind racing. The bear had been caught, but somehow it didn't make her feel any safer. The wilderness that had once called to her now seemed full of hidden dangers. Back in her apartment, Emily returned to her writing. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she poured her feelings onto the page. The bear is gone, they say, caught and relocated. But the fear remains, a constant companion. Every shadow holds a threat, every unexpected sound a potential danger. The wilderness that once inspired now terrifies. But in that terror, there's a story waiting to be told. As night fell, Emily found herself once again unable to sleep. She tossed and turned, her dreams filled with images of charging bears and endless forest chases. Finally, giving up on rest, she got up and went to her window. The lights of Jackson twinkled below, the mountains a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. It was beautiful, but Emily knew she'd never see it the same way again. The wilderness had shown her its teeth, and that knowledge had changed her forever. But as she stood there gazing out at the night, Emily felt a spark of determination. She had survived, and somehow she would find a way to turn this experience into something meaningful. Her writing had taken on a darker tone. Each word she typed a futile attempt to exorcise the terror that now lived within her. But perhaps that was the story she was meant to tell all along. Emily returned to her desk and opened a new document. She titled it, "Grisly Truths, A Survivor's Tale." As she began to write, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The fear was still there, but now it had purpose. She would use it, shape it into something that might help others understand the raw power of nature and the strength of the human spirit. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, Emily was still writing. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The lingering fear might never fully disappear. But she had survived, and she would continue to survive one day at a time. One word at a time. The bear might have taken her sense of safety, but it had given her something too, a story that needed to be told. And Emily Carter, writer and survivor, was ready to tell it.